The ANC has been targeted by opposition parties, some South Africans and global groupings for not implementing land justice. Many South Africans were dispossessed by the apartheid authorities. And while policies around compensation and the redistribution of land are in place, the pace has been slow. To discuss, we're joined by advocate Tembeka Toby, who is an author and land activist as well. Advocate, it's great to have you with us as always. We really appreciate your time. Firstly, to what extent do you believe the ANC's electoral decline, sometimes due to a sense of betrayal, is linked to the issue of land?
There is no doubt that land is a factor. What is unclear is how much of a factor is it? Is it a 2% factor? Is it a 10% factor? Is it a 60% factor? But there is no doubt that there is a general sense in which African people feel betrayed by the failure of the ANC to deliver on the land promise. But there is also no doubt that part of the story is the failure of the ANC to implement the Freedom Charter and to implement the Constitution itself, because one must remember that land justice is not only ANC policy, it's ANC policy that's been translated into a constitutional claim. So it's more than plausible, it is in fact probable that many people that either do not vote at all or vote for alternative political parties do so out of a sense of betrayal because of the manifest. I think the evidence is overwhelming that there has been a failure to address land injustice.
I'm going to ask you for a little history lesson, if you don't mind, but could you remind us what the Freedom Charter says about land and why many argue that the Freedom Charter itself is there for a rebuke to the ANC?
We must understand the Freedom Charter in the larger context of the policy evolution of the ANC. The Freedom Charter is a relatively recent document in the history of the ANC. It was only adopted in 1955. But the demand for land justice dates back to the establishment of the ANC itself. Remember that the ANC is launched in 1912 in Mangaung. And at the time at which it is launched, there is already a policy proposal in the Union Parliament being championed by Herzog, who at the time was the Minister for Native Affairs. And the policy that he is propounding at that stage in the government of Louis Botha is a policy to divide up the country into two, European settlement and native settlement. And he is proposing that the native settlement be confined to roughly less than 10% of the country. And at that stage, he is not yet clear whether it will be 5% or 2%. But what's clear is that he is advocating for the separation, geographic, physical, legal, territorial of the country into two. The ANC leaders, Isaka, are aware of this because these are the African intellectuals of the time. But there is also a second factor. The country has already been practically divided up into two because the whites have established the Union of South Africa, in which they have denied citizenship to native people. So the ANC is then launched as a platform for an alternative voice. It is regarded from the onset as a parliament of the people, because native people are also looking for a platform to articulate their concerns. One, they want to resist land injustice and land dispossession. Number two, they want a voice in the political affairs of the country. In other words, they want the rights to citizenship, which are denied to them at the onset. That policy finds concrete expression in 1943, when the ANC adopts what was later referred to as the Africans' claims at a conference incidentally also held in Mangaung. It sets out for the first time the most articulate statement that there should be a demand for the restoration of the land that was taken away by European settlers. At that point, there is no debate about whether compensation should or should not be paid. What is clear is that the racial discrimination on land allocation that comes from the 1913 Native Land Act is contested. The Freedom Charter is then the third in the policy evolution of the ANC that introduces a new dimension for the first time, which is the economic dimension. What the Freedom Charter does is two important things. First, on the issue of citizenship and governance, its opening pronouncement is that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And here is the most important part, which is usually forgotten. It says that no government shall claim any legitimacy unless it is based on the will of the people. So that's the slogan that is usually shortened to "the people shall govern." And the second clause that is again crucial to this discussion is the clause on land. What it says is that the land shall belong to all those who work it. It shall be shared among those who work it. And at that time, you could adopt a narrow definition of who works the land. Basically, what you have is many farm laborers that have been taken from the countryside and have been turned into wage laborers by the white regime. But you can also adopt a larger citizenship-based argument, which is that the allocation of land under the Herzog model, which was made law in 1913, even though Herzog himself had already left that position. That allocation was regarded as being unfair, and it was felt that there should be an equitable distribution of the land according to the needs, according to the citizens, and according to who lives and works on the land. Those demands, the three demands I've articulated, the founding demands, the 1943 demands, and the 1955 demands, are all consolidated in the Constitution that we see both in 1994, the interim Constitution, as well as in 1996, the final Constitution. They come as an expression of Section 25, and its primary mandate to Nelson Mandela's government is that Black people whose land rights have been discriminated against and disenfranchised must be returned, but that return must take place under the prescripts of an overriding constitutional framework. So that's the history against which the ANC is formed, and that is why it is fair for us, when we evaluate their performance, to ask them the central question of how far they have gone on the land issue.
And you are among those who've found that the ANC hasn't gone very far indeed. I mean, we're going to look at the land policies right now that the ANC is looking at. But if you look back, do you agree that the policies around compensation, about restitution and the redistribution of land have been good enough, but you still say that land reform failed? Just outline why you say that.
All right, let's first deal with the issue of policy. There is a distinction between what the Constitution provides and what the government policy has been. The Constitution has always provided for no compensation based on market-related standards, right? That was the deal in 1994. That was the deal in 1996. No one was ever entitled to market-based compensation. But despite the Constitution being permissive and expressly mandating the government, when it expropriates land in the public interest not to pay market-related compensation, the policy itself entrenched market-related compensation. Where this comes from, it comes from a paper published in 1997 called the White Paper on Land. It is that paper that expressly says when the government expropriates, in other words, it's forcibly taking property from an owner for purposes of wider distribution. When it does so, the policy says it should pay the owner as if the land was being sold in the open market by a willing buyer to a willing seller in open market conditions. That is what is called the willing buyer, willing seller. It is a contradiction of the Constitution. So right at the beginning, the ANC adopted for itself, without any pressure, external or internal, a policy that contradicts the basic law of the land. My own research, which is in Land Matters, the book I published in 2021, is that the genesis of that willing seller, willing buyer is in fact pressure that was put by the Land Bank on the country's new economic policy generally, and specifically the land policy. But it's never been part of the basic law of South Africa. It was a policy adopted by the ANC itself. And that is why I have argued that it is not difficult for the ANC to explicitly reject willing seller, willing buyer, because it's not the law, it is a policy that was adopted by the government. Now, the government has implemented faithfully the willing seller, willing buyer approach. In fact, its entire land reform strategy has been a market fundamentalist approach, driven primarily by the demands, the wishes, the desires of private landowners. And that is why we see the outcomes that we have. We have a market-based land reform policy. It has failed, it has not produced the outcomes. When I asked the former Minister of Land Affairs in 2018 at a conference at the University of Pretoria at Gibbs, I asked the then minister how much money had been paid by the government for land reform since 1994. I wanted the total figure. She told me the amount was 60 billion at that stage. I then asked how much of that 60 billion had gone to land reform beneficiaries versus the landowners. She told me the majority of it, in excess of 40 billion, had gone to white landowners. This is an astonishing fact that a constitution that is meant to be pro-poor, a land policy that is meant to be pro-poor, has in fact benefited landowners to the detriment of the dispossessed, who should be benefiting from the constitutional promise.
So, it's incredible, yes. And I'm sorry to rush you. We're going to run out of time, and this is so interesting. Can we fast forward? Because then the party has decided that the Constitution should explicitly say land expropriation without compensation. As you have argued, there was always provision to offer extremely low rates. Some said that the Constitution could be tested at R1 anyway. The ANC hasn't been able to pass that bill. The EFF says it doesn't go far enough. To what extent is it important for the public, for the way the ANC is held in our minds, to get that bill through? And to what extent is that just a red herring and the real issues aren't being addressed?
Yes, let me put it this way. We don't need the expropriation bill. Let us not fool ourselves about that. We need it. We need it to replace the 1975 apartheid expropriation law. So the government must push ahead and pass it. It can pass it because it enjoys 57% of representation in the National Assembly. It only needs 50+1. What it will achieve if it passes it, it will achieve the ability to acquire land and property at less than market rate, sometimes at completely without compensation, because there is an express provision in the bill. But, and here is the trick about this, that bill will not address the problems that you and me have in relation to lack of access to land, because its limitation is that it enables the government to acquire land for the purposes of the use by the state. Now, that does not mean that we don't need a bill like that. We absolutely need it. And the ANC in 2023 should push for that bill to be passed. Notwithstanding the objections from the private sector lobby, it must push that bill to be passed. We need it, and the bill is perfectly constitutional. What the ANC also needs, it needs a bill that will focus on redistribution. In other words, a bill that will focus on our needs for the land. It will not achieve that through the expropriation bill. It needs a new bill which will fulfill the constitutional mandate for equitable access to the land. I have, in an article I wrote towards the end of last year, provisionally termed that bill a land redistribution bill. That land redistribution bill, which has not been drafted yet, but it should be drafted alongside the Expropriation Act, must do three things. First, it must empower the state to acquire land, sometimes without compensation, sometimes with compensation, depending on the circumstances, but it must be nuanced as the Constitution requires. Secondly, it must empower the state to redistribute the land that it has acquired. It must have the power of redistribution to individuals, particularly the landless. And thirdly, it must introduce a criterion by which it determines whether the land should come to me as an advocate or whether it should come to someone else who is a farm worker. In other words, it must have a selection policy. That is the bill we need, as well as the expropriation bill.
Okay, so something that really refines how it will all work. Advocate, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully we can chat again. I have so many more questions, but we have run out of time. Advocate Tembeka Toby, author and land activist.